Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the virtual reading group. Today is November 15th, 2024. And as I just mentioned before we came on, let me just acknowledge that on Sunday this week, Jerome or Jerry Cohn passed away. Uh, he was Hannah Arendt's last research assistant. He was one of her closest remaining friends, and he was, as many of you know, a good friend of mine and the Arendt Centers. In fact, there would never have been a Hannah Arendt Center without Jerry's encouragement, and it was actually his idea that I start the center. So it's a great loss for many of us personally, but all of us collectively. And for those of you who've been in this group for a long time, know that Jerry was an active participant and always involved himself and asked questions, and did so with the kind of both sharpness and humility that we all should aspire to. So we go on in his memory and his honor, and just wanted to very much acknowledge his passing and his continued presence in our endeavor. So thank you for that, and we will carry on. Today we are reading Hannah Arendt's essay, The Crisis in Education, which is chapter 5 of her book, Between Past and Future. The essays in this book, as I've said many times, are exercises in thinking, specifically exercises in thinking designed for our age, for a time in which the break in tradition has happened, and we are sort of caught at this moment of between past and future, where we have to think for ourselves in a new way. And the chapters have gone in such a way that progressed in such a way that the first two are on the historical situation that confronts us. So the break in tradition, and the way that history seeks to respond, and modern history seeks to respond to the break in tradition. The next two chapters on what is authority and what is freedom are about, I think, two of the great statements of Arendt's work about the real crisis of the modern age, the loss of authority, and what that means for us, which is both an enormous loss and yet also an opening and a possibility to develop new ways of being and living together. And then what is freedom reminds us that freedom is something that is an ever-present possibility that we always can come back to, that is never lost, because to be human is to be free. It's to be a beginner, to be someone who can start anew amidst whatever crisis or processes that we're in. And so these are two of the great statements of her work as, I think, a lifelong attempt to meditate on and respond to and even resist the break in tradition that this whole book is about, and that her work is really about. The next four essays in the book are attempts to look at particular problems in the world. In this case, education. In the next chapter, the crisis in culture. After that, the crisis in truth and its relation to truth and politics, and the last one on science and technology, and to ask, okay, there are plenty of these crises in the modern world. How do we think through them? How do we respond to them? How do we, as humans with potential freedom to intervene in the world, respond to real life crises? and that's what these 4 essays are about. Um, and the first one is on the crisis in education. This essay is divided into 4 parts. The first part is largely preliminary, and yet it's also sort of brilliant. So we'll spend a little time on it. Part 2 looks at three what she calls the 3 presumptions that lead to the crisis. Part 3 is the core of the essay, where we actually look at her argument about what is the essence of education. And then part 4 brings us back to the question of the particular place that this crisis in education plays within the larger context of the crisis of authority in the modern age, and how we can, as free human beings, respond to it. So that's the structure of this essay. It was originally written in German, where it was called the Crisis der Erziehung. And it was translated, actually, one of the few essays, I think it's not translated, by Hannah Arendt. And we're going to see that there are a couple of places in the text where there are some real questionable translation issues, and we'll have to confront those. So part 1 begins with the problem of the crisis of education and political education in America. She begins simply by asking, what is a crisis? And this is something that's not unique to Hannah Arendt, right? There's many thinkers, political thinkers, social thinkers, who talked about how crises are important. For Arendt, crises are important because they lay bare the essence of something. In a real crisis, if you pay attention, you'll come to the core, or the essence. And what she says is that the essence of education is going to be the fact that human beings are born into the world. The word education, from the Latin educo, means to lead in. Education is the leading into the world of new people. And in this case, education, therefore, in its core, in its essence, brings up this problem of natality, of a birth into a world, and how we introduce or bring people into the world. If we take it seriously as a crisis, she says, we tear away the facades and obliterate the prejudices that prevent us from seeing clearly. And so she sees the crisis of education as an opportunity, right? Not just a crisis, but an opportunity that allows us to get into the core or essence of what education is, namely the fact that human beings are born into the world. When we turn to when we turn away from the specifics of the crisis of education to what she calls the general crisis, we understand that the crisis of education is, at least as it's experienced in day-to-day life, a crisis of the decline of standards, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Johnny can't read, add, or subtract, or write a good sentence. And but she says it's more than that. Simply Johnny can't read, or Jane can't read. There's got to be something, she thinks, much more to it. The fact that that there's so much effort and energy spent on trying to think through this crisis of education. And she thinks that it has to do with the fact that in America, education plays a much different role than it plays in other countries of the world, right? For America, education is essential as a way of bringing immigrants, as well as young people into the world, teaching them English, in a sense, teaching them a common culture, a kind of melting pot. And um, and there's this idea, she thinks, that we have a tendency to get really wrapped up in and worried about education in this country because it plays a political role. It in a country where people come from so many places in the world, and have so many different cultures and speak so many different language. There's a way in which education is the way we, especially public education, is the way we unite people and make them into Americans in some sort. And thus education is political. And so she thinks that's one of the reasons we spend so much time and energy on it. She then goes into a slight digression, but it's one that I just want to mention, which is to say that even though education is political, we have to remember, she says, that education can play no role in politics. On 173, she'll say, education can play no part in politics because in politics, we always have to deal with those who are already educated. Her point here is that if you want to educate adults, that's like tyranny. And again, I've used this example before, but I think it really matters. So many people, and my students, but also friends and colleagues, say to me, if we could just educate people right, make them watch the right newspaper, read the newspaper, right newspapers, and watch the right news shows, then they would all agree, and we'd be living in a much saner and more efficient world. And Arendt is very skeptical of that. She says, whoever wants to educate adults really wants to act as their guardian and prevent them from political activity. And she just says education has an evil sound in politics because when you try and educate adults, there's a pretense to education, but the real purpose is to coerce them without the use of force, or of course, tyrannize them. And so she's quite skeptical of that. I'm gonna, in part 2 of the essay, she talks about that one of the problems we have is the blurring of children and adults. And this comes from 3 presumptions, she says, that lead to the crisis of education. The first presumption is that the child is free from adult authority, and thus left to the power of their peer group. I imagine, although I don't know, that she's here referring to Jean Piaget and his theories of education. But in any case, the idea here is that if you really think that children should, in a sense, educate themselves as children, or that we should make the classroom democratic, as Dewey and Piaget argued at the time, she says you in a sense exit the adults from the classroom, and you create a kind of tyranny of the majority by the children, and she thinks that's quite dangerous. She says the second presumption is that teachers are emancipated from content and curricula and learn how to teach methods. And here she's, of course, referring to teachers' schools or teachers' colleges or masters in education, in which so many of them don't teach teachers the subject matter they're going to be teaching. You don't, if you want to teach math, you don't go to a master's in teaching and learn math. You go and learn how to teach. And she thinks that this is a disastrous approach, and it's one of the basic presumptions of modern progressive education. And third, she says there's this presumption that you only know what you do yourself, and that doing replaces learning. So we teach students skills, we don't teach them content. We teach them to play, we don't actually make them work. And so she says the example here is if you're going to learn a language, increasingly we teach languages the way people learn their mother tongue, right? Just by talking and immersion. But she says this only works if you're fully in immersion, if you actually live in the country. And what it really does is doesn't allow students to learn how to learn as adults, which is that you actually have to put in hard work and learn things. It infantilizes young people, and teaches them that the best way to learn is simply by play. And these are three presumptions that she says are sort of core to the progressive education model. The crisis that she's talking about comes from people saying, look, the result is a progressive education is Johnny doesn't learn how to read or write or do arithmetic or speak other languages. And so there's this reaction which says we need to go back to the old way, restore lost authority, and go back to a much more rigorous educational model. And spoiler alert here, but she's going to argue that neither of these are correct. And what we really need to do is understand what education is to get through this crisis. And so she says, I have going to answer two questions. One is, what is the essence of education? And that's what she's going to answer in part 3, which is the core part of this essay. And then she's going to answer the question, what is the true reason for the abandonment of common sense in education? And that's what she's going to answer in chapter 4. I should say, I didn't mention it, but common sense is for her an essential part of her story. What she wants to argue is that the loss of common sense is really the divining rod that she thinks has that shows us the crisis of education. She writes on page 175, the disappearance of common sense in the present day is the surest sign of the present day crisis. In every crisis, a piece of the world, something common to us all, is destroyed. The failure of common sense, like a divining rod, points to the place where such a cave-in has occurred. It's the loss of common sense that leads to the crisis in education. And so in the last part of the chapter, she's going to ask, what is the reason for this loss of common sense, and offer an answer to it. All right. Part 3 of the essay, which is really the central part of the essay, is about what is education. And she writes that the essence of education, as I said before, is how to bring new people into the world. She argues that education, coming from its Latin root educo, right, which is to lead forth, is the activity of leading young persons into the world, a world that already exists and into which they are inserted, first by birth and second by education. Right, so people are born and they're brought into the world, but they're not yet, they're just they're a baby, or they grow into a child. But to get into the world is not just grass and air and water. The world is a culture, and you have to bring them in, and that's what education is. In the original, it's the crisis of Erziehung in German, and Erziehung is an intensification of the verb ziehen, which means to pull. So education is a pulling of the student into the public world. The crisis of education, she says, is that educators are refusing in their responsibility to introduce students to the world as it is. Educators and parents also are refusing their responsibility because she thinks of a loss of authority, or of a crisis of authority. The loss of authority, which we talked about when we read the essay, What is Authority?, means that the claims of the world and the requirements of order in it, right? So the idea that the world has an order that makes claims on us, right, are being repudiated consciously or unconsciously by most of us. All responsibility for the world is being rejected. We say things like the world sucks, the world is awful, we hate the world. Arendt lived through some of the worst times in human history, through totalitarianism and Nazism and Bolshevism. And her lifelong philosophy was to love the world, amor mundi. And so, which is that, having, in a sense, succumbed to a general crisis of authority, teachers and parents today share a distrust of the world, right? We don't like the world. We don't trust it. We feel that the world is comprised of prejudices and injustices that undermine its authority. And thus, we have lost the answers on which we ordinarily would rely. We no longer believe our prejudices about what the world is and that the world is worth loving or worth respecting. And without the confidence in those answers or those prejudices, we end up refusing to recognize that the world we live in is actually a lovable and meaningful world. And we find it increasingly hard to welcome or lead our young people into what we think of as a meaningless world. For our end, however, the fact that the world into which children are introduced is a pre-existing world is central, right? You have to teach them, you have to lead them into the world. And this raises, she thinks, a few questions. The first is, how should a young person be taught and assimilated into the world as it already exists? And this leads to what Arendt calls her conservatism, her conservationism, namely that the world has to be preserved. But at the same time, it leads to something else. She says the world has to be preserved. We also have to have that. We also have to bring the children into it as newcomers, and as newcomers, the children will change the world into which they are born. And so, not only do we have to love and protect the world as it is and welcomes young people into it, but we have to protect young people in their newness so that they can change the world. And this is why, this is what I think is the most revolutionary, I shouldn't use that here, the most interesting and exciting part of Arendt's thinking about education, which is that it's both conservative and revolutionary. It's conservative in that we need to conserve the world as it is and welcome people into it. And it's conservative in the sense that we have to conserve the children and protect them against the world. But insofar as we protect the children against the world, we protect the children as a revolutionary force, as a force that can come into the world and change it. And insofar as we protect the children as a revolutionary force, we also protect a world that will change and always needs to change. And it's this double conservatism, revolutionary aspect of education that I find so unique and compelling in Arendt's educational thinking. So she says that education has a double aspect, right? On the one hand, the child, the subject of education, right? She says has a double aspect in that the new world that is strange for the child it needs to be preserved against the child. And yet, on the other hand, the child needs to be preserved against the world. And this leads her to make some very interesting comments about the need for privacy in the family. Because what she says is that everything that lives emerges from out of darkness. And however strong its natural tendency to thrust itself into the light, it needs the security of darkness to grow at all. This is on 183. And what that means is that if a child is going to grow and eventually be able to enter the world as an adult who can change the world, the child has to be protected from the world. The child needs to grow in darkness. They need to grow protected from the opinions, the prejudices, the surveillance, the conformity of the world. And so, she worries that children of famous parents will have so many problems because they're too exposed. Similarly, children that are brought into the world too quickly. You might think about social media or things like that today, where children present themselves to the world at a very young age. I think she would find that incredibly damaging to this ability of children to grow out of darkness. On the other side, on 182, she says the world too needs protection to keep it from being overrun and destroyed by the onslaught of the new that bursts upon it with each new generation. And so that's this double aspect that she is talking about. What this means is that in order to be a teacher or a parent, right, we have to assume responsibility for the world. She says on 186, anyone who refuses to assume joint responsibility for the world should not have children and must not be allowed to take part in educating them. In education, this responsibility for the world takes the form of authority. If you're not willing to tell your children, you can't do this, you must do this, you must do that, you must learn history, you must read Shakespeare, right? You must, go to class. If you're not willing to assert your authority over children, you shouldn't be a parent. And if you're not willing to tell them what they have to learn and introduce them into the world, you shouldn't be a teacher. And this is, I think, obviously going to be controversial in some circles, but it means that the teacher, the professor, the teacher, the parent has to have enough faith in the world that even if they disagree with it, they know that their job is to bring the student into it and teach the student that world, not in a critical way, but as it is. And only by doing that do we allow the children to learn the world themselves and decide how to change it. Too many professors, I think Arendt thinks, and too many teachers and think, I know how the world should change. I'm going to teach the students not the world, but how to change the world. And they start doing, social justice education or things like that. And Arendt says, no, if you want to preserve revolutionary possibilities, which we need, she says, you can't teach social justice. You have to teach the world and give the students their own chance to rebel against it and revolt. This leads her to her philosophy of education, which she calls conservation, which is conservative, but I've tried to say it's conservative in a very radical and revolutionary way. So on 188, she writes, it seems to me that conservatism, in the sense of conservation, is of the essence of the educational activity, whose task is always to cherish something, the child against the world against the child, the new against the old against the new. We have to always conserve both the new and the old, the child and the world. Now, here, this is on page 189, and if you have the book in front of you, I encourage you to take a look at it. Because what she here does is she now makes a number of distinctions. And if you look at this paragraph that begins basically basically we are always educating for a world, you'll see that in this paragraph, she uses the word preserve 3 times, right? Each time that word is translating a different word or phrase in German. And I think you have to pay very close attention to what she's doing here. So on the first use of it, she says, in politics, this conservative attitude, which is not conservative in like a political sense so much as conservation, but okay, this conservative attitude, which accepts the world as it is striving only to preserve the status quo and can only lead to destruction because the world is irrevocably delivered up to the ruin of time unless human beings are determined to intervene, to alter, or to create what is new. Now, in this sense, the word that's translated as preserve is erhalten, which in German means to preserve or to conserve or to maintain. And so the idea here is that the world will, if we don't do anything, the world will fall apart, right? and we can't simply be conservative, right? And it will lead to destruction if we simply try and conserve the world as it's been, because the world needs to change because we change and we bring new people into it. And so Erhaltenheit, conservation in this sense, will lead to destruction. The second important use of the word preserve here is in the sense that says to preserve the world against the mortality of its creators and inhabitants, it must be constantly set right anew. The problem is simply to educate in such a way that a setting right remains actually possible, even though it can, of course, never be assured. So we have to preserve the world, not to keep it as it was, erhalten, but now to set it right anew, which means to halten est in its sein, im Sein halten, to hold or keep it in its state of being. And so this is another way that we conserve the world. The third, and I think for Arendt, the most important way we conserve the world is in this last sentence where she says, exactly for the sake of what is new and revolutionary in every child, right? That the child is new and revolutionary. Education must be conservative. It must preserve this newness and introduce it as a new thing into an old world, which, however revolutionary its actions may be, is always, from the standpoint of the next generation, superannuated and close to destruction. So in this case, the word preserve is bewahren, to retain or to perpetuate or to keep true. So we need to preserve the newness of each child, their revolutionary newness in each child, and introduce each child as a new thing into an old world. And thus allow that child to change the world in that way, but to keep it true as it does so. The last section of the essay is asking after the true reason for the abandonment of common sense in education. Why did we lose our way? Why did we go down this mode of progressive education, which is wrong? And we have to also protect ourselves against the sort of response to it, the sort of radical conservative response that we just have to go back to, rigorous hitting people with a stick education. And Arendt says that the crisis in education is connected with the loss of tradition and a loss of respect for the past. She says on 191 that the teacher's authority was firmly grounded in the encompassing authority of the past, right? That teachers have authority because they're teaching what they know, what has already been learned. The teacher mediates, she says, between the old and the new. The problem is, and this is what led to the crisis, is that the past authority has been lost. The pillars of a tradition have broken. We can't go back. We can't just impose the authority of the past. But she wants to say, we also can't simply keep going on and teaching because the way we are, because if we don't recognize the past and we also don't recognize the loss of the past, we're just going to keep becoming more alienated and estranged from the world. We increasingly, she thinks, don't love the world. We see it as a world to be overcome. And at that point, we can't be educated. We can't be educated into a world. And that alienates us, and that can lead to incredible loneliness and meaninglessness that, of course, can lead to totalitarianism. And that's the overarching thread here. And so she says a third way is that we have to admit the loss of tradition and the loss of authority of the past. And we have to see that increasingly our world is a world driven by the loss of freedom and automatic processes that drive us forward without us really thinking anything about them. But amidst this loss of authority and the break of tradition, she says we have to remember that it lies within the power of human thought and action to interrupt and arrest such processes, right? That's on page 191, but it's also the conclusion of her essay, What is Freedom? The point is that for her, the problem of education in the modern world is that by its very nature, education cannot forego authority or tradition. And yet we have to educate people today in a world in which we have neither authority nor tradition. And that means that not just teachers or educators, but all of us, insofar as we live in the world together with our children and our young people, have to, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting and underappreciated aspects of Arendt's essay. Insofar as any of us live and encounter young people today, we have to treat them differently than other adults, right? You know, there's all this stuff about treat young people as adults, or they want to be treated as adults. She says, no, you have to treat them as children. You can't treat them as, we have to treat them differently. She says we have to divorce the realm of education from the realm of politics or other realms of public and political life. And we have to insist on keeping the idea of authority alive in education. Now, remember, she just wrote an essay that we read where she says there is no authority left in the modern world. And what she says is that's true. And in politics, we have to learn to live without authority, because as adults, we can't educate each other. We have to learn to live without the authority and the traditions. And that's hard, but that's what we have to do. But she says children still need to be educated, and you can't educate without authority. Education needs authority and tradition. Our world has lost authority and tradition. So educators must take a non-modern attitude towards authority and tradition as educators that's different from the attitude they take in the world of politics as citizens. We have to, in a sense, divorce education from public and the political world and apply authority to education that no longer exists. We have to act, have to act authoritatively. Now, we shouldn't make it up. We should admit to students that we live in a time in which authority has been lost, but we have to be authoritative in explaining both what authority was and its loss and how to address that. And this means, she says, we have to reconcile ourselves to the loss of authority in the world, but to some degree resist that in education. And this means, and to do that, she says, we have to love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, even when doing so means assuming authority in education that cannot be assumed politically. And so she says on 189 to 190, the real problem with education is that in spite of the talk of conservative education, education that conserves is extraordinarily hard to achieve because of the crisis of authority and education and the crisis of tradition. Instead, she says, education is the point at which we decided whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, by the same token, save it from the ruin which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and young, would be inevitable. And that's the tough position of education today, to assume responsibility for a world that we know has lost its authority and tradition, and teach them not that the authority and tradition still exist, but somehow teach them authoritatively about the need to live in a world that has been shorn of, or that has lost its political authority, but we have to do so authoritatively. And that's her response to the crisis in education. All right, so I will stop there. We have hopefully have a nice discussion coming before us. Remember, you can enter the discussion in the chat. Please be respectful of each other. And you can also go down to the reactions button and raise your hand and join us in that way. Look forward to it. James, you're first.
Roger, I've been encountering people on the subway and in the street that seem to be being controlled by the cell phone in their hands. And I'm looking at what they are looking at, and I'm able to see it. They're oblivious to me. And I'm reading this book by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation. And I'm positing that with cell phones, since he argues that since 2010, we've moved from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And in doing so, there's no authority, there's no tradition, there's no education, only by stimulation and manipulation. This quote by Polybius, to educate is to let you see you are worthy of your ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
With these cell phones, there are no ancestors. There is no common sense. So I'm wondering, we're trying to, the best way to learn is by play, she argues. And when we eliminate play in favor of these screens, there's no that we've lost our common sense.
Yeah.
Where
So,
would she go now?
so first of all, let me just
And I
make
miss
sure,
Jerry terribly.
make sure we, yeah, we all miss Jerry terribly. Thank you, James. Let me just clear up one potential misunderstanding. She's not in favor of a play-based education.
Oh, okay.
She's very worried that a play-based education infantilizes young people. I mean, I think for very young people, maybe up to the age of 7 or 8 or 9, I don't know what the right age is. Play-based curriculum might be quite useful and productive. I'm not going to get into that fully now. I know in Finland and some other countries, play-based education goes up to like 3rd or 4th grade, and it's very effective. She's talking, I think, about older children in middle school or high school, and certainly in college, and saying that at some point you need to prepare people for the adult world, and that's going to require studying and hard work and not just learning by playing. um uh the other question, the general question you're asking about phones, I think is a good one, although um you know again, I don't know what's happening around the country or the world, but certainly in my children's schools, phones are not a big part of the curriculum or education. I mean, my kids are not even allowed to use their phones during the day in school. I don't know if that's different where other kids are, and I'm sure there's variations on it. But you know, I think that there's no doubt that we all have experienced doom scrolling or whatever you call it, where you're stuck on, and you pick your phone out of your pocket to check the time, and the next thing you know, it's 20 minutes later and you've done nothing but scroll through who knows what. We've all been there, and phones are a very addictive and anxiety producing medium that we have to learn to live with. I think Jonathan Haidt's point to some degree is that adults have trouble with it, but at least they have learned over time how to control certain impulses, we hope, and are able to do so. But children have a much harder time with it, in that we have to protect our children from phones. And I think it's a legitimate argument. As a parent, I can tell you it's not easy. But at some point, I at least I can tell you, in my kids, right? I mean, they use their phones a lot, but the point is that they don't only use their phones. They go to school, they don't use their phones for 8 hours a day during school. They play sports or they do activities. They're not using their phones then. I think we have to understand that we're not going to get rid of phones, but I think what you have to do is provide times and activities where children and people learn to engage in the real world, and that's part of what parenting and teaching is teaching them um to learn the world, and you're not going to learn it by scrolling through your phone. So I'm with you, and I'm with John Haidt. I just I don't think we're gonna get rid of phones. I think we have to just put in um we have to put in places and protections not necessarily legally, but we have to encourage people to not always have their phones with them. I mean, that's the way I would put it. You know, I've struggled with that too. I mean, I have to leave my phone when I want to get reading done, right? And it's not an easy thing. But it's something we all have to do. All right.
Thank you.
Yep, Susan.
So in my book, this is on page 175, but it's a different one than you have.
Can
The
you tell me where it is or what's the paragraph?
It's at the very beginning. It's just third page in, paragraph says more decisive, however.
Okay, it's on 172 in my
Okay.
book. All right.
Okay. So she says, for America, the determining factor has always been the motto printed on every dollar bill, Novus Ordo Seclorum, which we've had a dialogue group on, and we're looking to do part 2, a new order of the world. And then she ties it to immigrants. The immigrants, the newcomers, are guaranteed to the country that it represents the new order. And then the meeting of this order, this founding of a new world against the old, was and is the doing away with poverty and oppression. And I was really surprised to see that, since my understanding of her critique of the French Revolution was that it was overly focused on those issues, whereas she claims the American Revolution was focused on freedom. So I'm curious how those two ideas go together.
Yeah, I mean, I think she in On Revolution, which I take it is the book you're talking about in your dialogue group. What she says is that you know, the Americans saw you know, the freedom of the new world as one of freedom from poverty and oppression, but that what it really at its best was a new kind of public freedom, and that it sort of goes back and forth between the two, but over time we've lost the focus on public freedom and really only care mostly about poverty and oppression. So, you know, I mean, I think it's both. She realizes that most people came here looking for you know, a better life, which could be both public freedom, but also could be escape from poverty and escape from oppression. And I think in On Revolution, she says all of those were present. She thinks that what made the political aspect of the country important is that they focused on public freedom, and that over time that focus on public freedom has been sacrificed to the focus on social freedom. That's how I think, you know, I see it. I don't see it as absolutes in either way. I mean, I don't think in one book she was saying it's public freedom, and here she's saying it's social freedom. You know, she takes it very seriously that in this country we welcomed most of the immigrants who came to this country were not rich, right? They were poor. Give me your, you know, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. So I don't think she has ever denied that that was part of the sort of founding idea of the country. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Dina.
Hi, I have a question about what connects the loss of authority in the public realm and political life to the loss of authority in the private realm, in the pre-political realm. And it seems that Arendt sees that connection rooted in Plato's and Aristotle's understanding of authority of parents over children as a model by which to understand political authority. That comes up on page 187 in my edition. And And then she says, so that it lies in the nature of the crisis in authority that began in the public realm, that it should end up as a crisis in authority in the private realm. And so my question is it in the nature of the concepts of political thought, such as in Plato and Aristotle and their modeling of authority in the parent-child, with a parent-child analogy, is it in the nature of that political concept that we end up in a crisis of education? In other texts, Arendt contrasts that model, the Platonic Aristotelian model, with Rome and how it defined authority. So had that vision, the Roman vision of authority, won, would we have skirted the crisis in education? I'm thinking of augere and gerere in Roman tradition, where, you know, the elders are sort of modeled because they are old, etc.
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, in the, you know, in the What is Authority essay, you know, there is a chapter on Plato, right? Chapter part 2 on Plato, which is that truth replaces persuasion as a way of establishing authority. And then in the next part, chapter part 3, she says for Aristotle that the way he seeks to establish authority is through education. And you know, where the younger ones are educated into authority. I don't think that's that different from you know, the Roman approach, which is to see the citizens not necessarily educated into authority, but to see the authority of the founding. They have to be tied back to it through religion, in sort of a Roman public religion. And so, you know, I think they're all quite, I don't think there's that much difference that she sees in those regards. You know, in this passage that you've turned us to on 187, she's simply saying that there's a connection between the loss of authority in public and political life and in education or in private pre-political life. And that the more radical we have lost authority in political life, the more likely it is that it will also infect private life.
But she seems to go beyond that. She doesn't just simply say that it's more likely. She seems to say, and in fact does say expressly, thus it lies in the nature of the matter. That is,
she says, okay, she says, thus it lies, okay, it is based, first of all, on the absolute superiority, right, of parent over child, right? And that's the nature of the matter. So thus it lies in the nature of the matter, that is both the nature of the present crisis and authority, and in the nature of our traditional political thought, where parental authority over children was a model for political
right.
authority as well, that the loss of authority, which began in the political sphere, should end in the private one. And it is naturally no accident that the place where political authority was first undermined, that is in America, should be the place where the modern crisis in education makes itself most strongly felt. Yeah, I mean, if authority exists both in public and private, and in a sense, there's the private is a model for the public. If we lose authority in the public realm, it's not unlikely or surprising that we'll lose it in the private realm too. This okay, when she says thus it lies in the nature of the matter, you know, I think that's what she's saying, is that because authority was naturally modeled on the paternal model, when the model breaks down, it's not, you know, it's very natural that the thing that was the model for it, or the original for it, will break down too. I mean, I wouldn't put too much and too much at stake in the in her use of the word nature of the matter there.
Well, I don't mean to belabor this, but there is a couple of lines ahead. She says there is this additional fact, and it is very likely the decisive one, that from time out of mind, we have been accustomed in our traditional political thought to regard the authority of parents over children, of teachers over pupils, as the model by which to understand political authority. So it seems like that this choice of a model is what is at the root of this crisis in the pre-political private realm.
Maybe. I mean, you know, I think that's just true, right? That has been the model. I mean, Plato saw it as the model, Aristotle saw it as the model, the Romans saw it as the model. I don't, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what else to make of it. I think the point is that authority, which she thinks no longer exists in the modern world, started in the private sphere and to some extent inspired the need for it in the public sphere. We are now experiencing the full-on loss of authority in the public sphere. And it's not surprising that we also see a challenge to authority in the private sphere. What she's going to say is that's all true, but we have to, in a sense, well, we have to accept the loss of authority in the public sphere because we're all adults, and that's what politics is. In the private sphere, we can't accept the loss of authority because then we would never be able to educate anybody. And so that's her argument. You know, I don't, maybe there's something in this model thing that you're seeing that I'm not, but it's more of a, I don't see it as a, you know, I don't see that as a central point to what she's arguing. I just don't get it. If it is, I won't hold out the part that it couldn't be. I just don't understand it if it is. John. John, are you there?
Sorry. In my edition on page 179, the paragraph beginning, "In this connection, we must bear in mind." So I think it's 3 pages off from yours. Do you see it? It's about the concept of equality.
The paragraph begins, "In this connection."
In this connection, we must bear in mind. It's on my page 179.
Oh, okay. It's 176. Okay, thank you.
176. All right. So she talks about the unique role that the concept of equality plays and has always played in American life, and that this has aggravated the crisis in education. Much more is involved in this than equality before the law, more too than the leveling of class distinctions, more even than what is expressed in the phrase equality of opportunity, though that has a greater significance in this connection because in the American view, a right to education is one of the inalienable civic rights. All right. And then she goes on to talk about in England, by the time you're 11 years old, they take an examination. And are they going to be, if they pass that examination, they can go on to higher education. If they don't pass it, they don't. And I'm interested in this idea of the concept of equality that plays such a large part in American culture in general, American history, and so on, as having subverted the idea that some people are fit for certain kinds of work and not others. That higher education makes sense for people who are interested in it and capable of doing it. but that what we have evolved to believe is that everybody deserves to have a college education. That is the standard of success. If you don't have a college education, you don't stand a chance to be successful in life, and success means having financial security. All right. So this leads me to think about students wearing uniforms or going to school in shorts and tights and everything else as if they're still children. Whereas if they wore uniforms, they would be seen as a special, involved in a special activity and so on. So my question is, the degree to which the concept of equality, which is one of our founding ideals, has kind of influenced education for the worse.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, so she thinks that education, that equality has clearly influenced American education more than other countries, more than in other countries. And as she says at the end of part one, so in the, where you're reading, she says there's great advantages to this and great disadvantages to it. The advantages of equality in education are, the leveling of class distinctions, right? The equality of opportunity, the American view of a right of education as an inalienable civic right. These are what she considers its advantages. She thinks it has many advantages, and she's not counseling us to get rid of it. In fact, at all, as far as I understand it. What she's saying is that we also have to understand that it comes with costs. And we can only responsibly enjoy the advantages it comes with if we are aware of its costs and try and reduce them. And what are the two costs? Well, she makes it crystal clear in the final paragraph of the first section, where it begins, thus what makes educational crisis in America so especially acute, right? Is the political temper of the country, which of itself struggles to equalize or to erase as far as possible the difference between young and old, between the gifted and the ungifted, finally between children and adults, particularly between pupils and teachers. It is obvious that such an equalization can actually be accomplished only at the cost of the teacher's authority and at the expense of the gifted among the students. However, she says it is equally obvious that to anyone who has ever come in contact with the American educational system that this difficulty, rooted in the political attitude of the country, also has great advantages, right? What are the two great disadvantages or costs of this incredible focus on equality in the American educational system? Is the teacher's authority and the gifted, and a cost to the gifted amongst the students. On the second, the gifted amongst students, I mean, you see this all over. I mean, there's, we have debates. I mean, I know when I was growing up and still with my, huge debates about whether we should have gifted and talented programs and what they should be. And should we have special courses for the gifted, or should everyone learn the same way? And, there's all sorts of arguments about whether it's good for the gifted students to have separate classes or should they be with everybody else. And people have, gone back and forth on this for generations. I think there's no doubt that, to some degree, to the extent that we don't have these special programs and that everyone is supposed to learn in the same classes in the same ways, it hurts many gifted students. I'm sure there's some gifted students for whom it just doesn't matter, but it probably hurts some. And I think, that's a cost. That's not the main cost she's concerned with here. The main cost she's concerned with is the cost to the teacher's authority. Because if the teacher gets up in front of the class and the students think the teacher has nothing to teach them, or if the teacher thinks I'm no better than the students, I know nothing more than they, and they're smarter than me and they can lead, then she thinks we undo the very nature of education, which is for a teacher who is learned in and educated in the past of our world to transmit that world and lead the young people into it. And so that's the cost that she's concerned with, and that in especially as in section 3 and 4 she's going to come back to and try and address. But you know, I think what's very interesting about these sections that you pointed us to is you know, she's not arguing against equality in education. And she's saying there are real advantages to it. And that we need to, as Americans, we have to be true to the American idea and not abandon it, but we have to be honest about its costs and attempt to address them. Okay. Is that good?
Yes, I'm just wondering about the costs and how to mitigate the effect that she's talking about. That's all.
Well, I mean, you know, there's plenty of ways that people have tried, whether it's through gifted and talented programs or whether it's through separate schools, or, you know, whether it comes later in, you know, specialized schools like they have in New York City, but have been very controversial. You know, there's all sorts of different ways that people try and do it. I don't think there's one answer. That becomes a policy question. You know, and again, nothing wrong with it, but that's not what she's at right there. She's just trying to identify them.
Okay. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you. George? George, are you there? I can't hear you.
Just to continue on authority, again, there's the Greek aspect, there's the Jerusalem aspect, and I think nobody questions that some sort of authority is needed. The question is it going to be one person or is it going to be a few elites? So that's really what we're standing now. So the question I have in a sort of different area, because, you know, somebody like Arendt would like to have a polis type of a thing and have an elite group that's an open society and the rest is a closed society, or Glosio Cola someplace else. And that's what Leo Strauss said, the same thing, except he's in a different area than Arendt. But the thing that interested me, Roger, is I think there's a real crisis afoot when you start quoting Ernst Jünger. And I'd like to talk about that part of it, ask you about that part of it, because you went into it.
Hold on, what? No one's quoting Ernst Jünger here.
You were.
When?
Oh, I just read a thing.
Oh, in another, but I didn't quote him today.
I'm sorry?
I didn't quote him today.
No, but I think that's I think it's an issue I'd like to raise. The thing is that when you're in a crisis situation like we are right now, the question is, do you seek danger?
Okay. I'm not sure I understand, but
That is the difference between, well, one of the differences, Arendt has loneliness, and the answer to loneliness is friendship, community, etc., etc. Jünger has boredom, and the answer to boredom is danger. That is, and this is what's the new right is looking for, right? They're looking for danger. And what is the answer to that?
you know, I am, that seems to take us far afield from the book we're reading right now.
Men in hard times.
I don't know what that is, but, you know, in this particular case, what she's saying is, we do need authority, is something um, we cannot recreate in the political world. But we have to take the risk, I think, if you want to use the word danger, one can, of insisting upon authority for teachers and adults in their dealings with children, because children need authority. But that you can't do that in the political world, because we're not children, we're adults, and that's unjustified. So, you know, I think that many teachers, and many parents, are afraid of exercising their authority today, in an educational environment, because they have become convinced that they don't have any. And that they don't know the best way, and that, you know, they're not confident that teaching or forcing their students or their children to do it this way is the right thing. And I understand that. But RN's view is that if you're not willing to assert authority, you shouldn't have children. Not going to sugarcoat it. That's her view. And if you're not willing to, you know, teach from authority and know something, you shouldn't be a teacher. Now, what she means by authority doesn't mean my opinion. She means knowledge about the world, right? And you know, if I'm going to teach math, I shouldn't let the children tell me, well, I don't like that math. And if I'm going to teach Spanish, they shouldn't say, well, I don't like those grammar and I want to do it differently. And I'm going to teach literature, they shouldn't say, well, I don't like Shakespeare. I mean, you know, Shakespeare is part of the world and you got to learn it. You don't have to like it, but you got to learn it. And then you can rebel against it. And eventually Shakespeare may no longer become a central part of the world, right? That happens. Things change. The world changes. That's her point. That we need to bring, you need to let the young people change it, as newcomers, not tell them how we think they should change it. That's her argument there. They have to be taught the world, and they have to, in a sense, make it their own. And that will change the world. And I think that's why her philosophy of education is both conservative and, in the end, revolutionary. Wendy.
Hi, I'm brand new to this group. It's great.
Welcome.
Thank you. So my question is, Arendt says we have to teach the world and give the children their own chance to rebel. What if the children want to conform and are learning the world so as to learn the rules and then want to take the easier route by conforming?
You know, some will, there's no doubt, right? Most will, I imagine. You know, and that's good. The world can't change all at once. And if everyone, and you know, if every child came in and said, you know, when I'm 18, I'm just going to change the world, it would be chaos. The world changes slowly. Although every once in a while there's a revolution, but the revolutions are usually quite conservative. I mean, that's part of Arendt's idea of revolutions. They're usually bringing us back to a foundation rather than away from one. Yeah, no, I think for her, it's a give and take process that over time allows the world to change and yet remain the same. You don't want to sort of burn the world down. You've got to let it change, but slowly enough that it's still recognizable to people of different generations. So that's her, I think that's her approach. Yeah, I'm not sure I can say much more. Karen,
Well, there's a lot of things that I want to say, and I don't know. I wrote some notes, so I'll remember what I want to say. But the thing about the play and work, I think she sees those as actually opposites. And I don't believe that play and work are actually opposites. The play can also be an educative process. And I think even with the older children, as you mentioned, maybe in middle school and beyond, if they're working on projects, that's integrated learning. And so they're covering a lot of bases instead of some of the silos. If you have things, children and teenagers just going to certain classes for certain things instead of having things integrated to learn together. And I think of Maheli Csikszentmihalyi, who talked about flow. And flow is that idea that when you're really involved in an activity, you are just, you know, you lose sense of time. Kids don't even want to go and eat lunch, and you know how they're usually hungry. So, and that's that idea where it is a more consuming and interesting activity that they're doing, and that can be done in a playful manner, and it goes like on a continuum. So I don't know how much she really talked to educators at the time. I'm thinking maybe she didn't, I don't know, of young children. So that was just one thing. And then the idea about authority, there's always going to be that authority because they have to make decisions about how the class is set up, what they're doing, and things like that. And I think about the idea of multiple intelligences from Howard Gardner, you know, and you don't ask, how are you smart, but how smart are you? And so I think the education, I think there is crisis in education. There's usually always that. But and maybe not the things that I think she was talking about here. Not that I don't think she has some good points, excellent, some very excellent points. But do you know if she really talked with educators at all, or this is just her observations that she was making from, you know, things she read or things like that?
Well, I mean, she is an educator,
Well, I know that, but I mean educating children.
right. So one of the questions in the that I don't know how to answer per se, it is when she thinks where she thinks the dividing line between children and adults is. I think to some degree, she thinks undergraduate education should still be educating young people. And although it's not entirely clear, and I don't know where she actually draws the line. You know, as for whether, you know, I know, I imagine she's responding to a particular debate going on in the United States in the 1950s around progressive education, and a response to it that would bring back conservative education. And she's trying to say both of these are mistaken, and we have to you know, understand that the true essence of education is you know, leading people into a common world that they share. You know, there are you know, plenty of good educators out there who try and use techniques that work. But, you know, again, this was after her time, but I am old enough to remember, you know, a certain period where people said we should only use phonics, to teach people how to read. You know, and other people said, no, you should just have them read. And, you know, you had radicals on both sides. And by the way, you still in some places have radicals on both sides. One side saying, just have them read and they'll figure it out. And the other side saying, no, use phonics. You know, I think, in the same way, you know, there were without a doubt people who said you should only have play and that the teacher should basically barely be in the classroom, is only there for safety and let the kids figure it out. And there are other people who think the kids should be sitting in rooms and the teacher should be wielding a ruler or a strap and busting it out of them. I think, you know, there's extremes on all the sides. Her point is not any of that. You know, her point is that, you know, if you look at the trends in education, they are increasingly towards teaching by doing and learning by doing and learning by playing. I mean, I don't think that's I think that's undeniable. It's still the case. And you know, she thinks that as a result, you know, I'm sure it works for some people. It does. And some people implement it very well. Some teachers implement it very well. But overall, it's certainly led to an educational crisis. And you know, what she's saying is that it's reflective of a deeper crisis and one that matters more, which is our misunderstanding of what education is. I mean, she's not here engaging in a debate about whether one should use phonics or play or this or that. I am sure you're right, and she would agree with you that some play is good and some rigorous memorization is good. That's not the argument of this text, right? This argument is that the crisis and the sides and the two different sides that people are taking are indicative of and point to a deeper misunderstanding of what education is, and that's what she's trying to think about here. Okay.
Well, I have other responses, but I know there's other hands. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Welcome. Anthony.
Yes, yes, Roger. There was so much of value here. I certainly got a lot out of it. But my big question or takeaway was in our contemporary context, the fact of the matter is that education has been politicized. I understand the argument that education and politics should be separated, but the fact of the matter is that education has been politicized. So you had at one point basically more of, not to oversimplify, sort of an American, particularly in the social studies and humanities, you had sort of an American exceptionalism, Western superiority. That's been challenged. We cannot agree now on what should be taught, what interpretations we should pass on to young people, even in the lower grades. It's highly contested. It's highly ideological. So what would Arendt say to that? We're in a political space right now. So
Of course. I mean,
Yeah.
but again, that's not what, again, I think that's similar to Karen's question. You're just like there's going to be different methods to teach, you know, there's also going to be different subjects to teach, and people are going to argue about what to teach. I mean, both of those are peripheral to you know, her argument here, right? Which is not to say she doesn't talk about them. She does. But this book is not about, you know, whether we should read Marx or Adam Smith. It's about that if we're going to teach economics, we should teach the world as it's been given to us and as it is. And I think that if you're a good teacher, you're going to teach both Smith and Marx, and you're going to teach through, rigorous memorization and analysis, and you're going to teach through play and doing. And so, her argument is not about how to teach or what to teach, right? That's not the sort of, that's not what this book is about. She does, she's responding to a particular debate going on probably in the pages of the New York Times and the New Yorker, knowing what she reads in the 1950s, where people are, upset and arguing about the fact that educational achievement is down in the United States. And some people are saying it's because of progressive education. And some people are saying, no, it's because you have to, there's too much of the strap and the ruler and you got to go back. And she's saying, all right, there's this debate. There's a crisis, but crises, crises will be useless if we don't tear off and get behind the prejudices and the assumptions that underlie them. And in this case, she's saying, let's tear those prejudices and assumptions off, right? Let's get beyond this idea of equality, get beyond this idea of the teacher, student relationship. And let's understand what's really going on. And what's really going on is we've lost authority in the world. Teachers and parents are losing authority over their children. And as a result, we've fundamentally lost an understanding of what education is. And that is that we need to both lead children into a world that already exists that we have to teach them about, but we also have to protect them in their skepticism and newness so that they can react against it.
Right.
And so I think that's the structure here. I understand because she's writing about things that, are political or that people care about, like progressive education or conservative education, or, whether you should read Marx or Smith. It makes sense to get caught up on that, but that's not what she's caught up on here.
That's not the thing. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah. We're
Thank you.
out of time, but I'm going to take one more question from Burma and then we'll have to unfortunately go.
Thank you, Roger. Could it be that Arendt has different understandings of crisis? I mean, when she talks about the crisis of authority, it is about a decline of authority in terms of public legitimacy. When she talks about the loss of tradition, it is about a crisis of public legitimacy. Now, when talking about a crisis in education, education has not lost its place in the public world. When introducing new participants into the public world, we are introducing them not in a world where education has lost its public legitimacy. So I am wondering, would Arendt use different understandings of crisis, though they are all interlinked, but would her understanding of crisis in connection to public legitimacy be different?
Thanks. Thanks, Burma. I mean, legitimacy is not a word she's using quite a lot. I think what she means by a crisis is that she says it tears away the facades and obliterates prejudices, and it allows us to inquire into what is laid bare. The crisis of authority is not the same as the loss of authority. The crisis of authority is that we lay it bare. And we can ask, what is authority and what is the lack of authority, and how do we live without it? The crisis of authority may lead to a crisis of legitimacy, but I don't think it's the same thing. The crisis of legitimacy is that we wonder if governments are legitimate. The crisis of authority is that we have no, the loss of authority, and the crisis of authority means that the very idea of authority and experience of authority is something that is lost to us today in the modern world. The crisis of education is not about the legitimacy of education. It's that in a world in which there is no authority, and in which authorities are being fundamentally questioned and not recognized, we have a problem, because unlike politics, where you can still live without authority, even though it's hard, you can't, she thinks, educate without authority. Now, I mean, it's possible one could try and, I mean, it's certainly more than possible. One could argue with her and say, well, actually, children can learn on their own just fine. And they don't need to be led. They can lead themselves. And, again, there are, people like Piaget and Dewey have made, again, I don't want to, it may be Karen knows much more than I do about these things, but I have taught these folks. And that is what they say, at least as I read it. I could be wrong. But Arendt wants to say that kind of teaching will lead nowhere, and will not allow us to either save or change the world. It will just lead to more and more world alienation and more estrangement from the world. And so that's her argument, as I understand it. Here, I think it's a very powerful argument. I know as a teacher, right? To me, it means a lot. Things it has done for me is remind me not to tell my students what I think, how I think they should change the world. That's not my job, right? My job is to help them understand the world, including the contemporary world, but also the older world, and let them make their own decisions. And I think that's important for both teaching students, but also teaching your children. And it's one of the hardest things about being a parent, right? Is at that point where your children decide what they want to do with their lives, and it's not what you want them to do with your life. And that's part of what Arendt is here talking about.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.